You're here already, and that matters more than you think. This isn't about whether you believe in reality shifts or coincidence. The real conflict started before you pressed play. In the moment, something in you paused just long enough, and your attention moved here without effort. Not because you were searching, but because something stopped making sense the way it used to. So here's the question that won't let go easily. What had to subtly change in your perception for this moment to happen? Not externally, internally. Because if nothing had shifted, this would have blended into everything else you've ignored today. Yet it didn't. This video isn't here to convince you of anything. It's here to create tension between what you think brought you here and what actually did. Stay with that tension. By the end, you won't be asked to believe, only to notice whether your way of seeing has already begun to move. Almost everyone who starts searching for meaning, alignment, or some form of inner awakening makes the same mistake. And it's so normalized that it rarely gets questioned. You were taught directly or indirectly to look for big signs, clear confirmations, emotional highs, moments that feel undeniable, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. The kind of experiences that announce themselves loudly and leave no room for doubt. So you start scanning reality with that expectation. You wait for something to happen out there that will finally prove you're on the right path. A breakthrough, a synchronicity so obvious it feels scripted, a sudden sense of certainty that removes all ambiguity. And when those moments don't arrive or don't last, you assume nothing meaningful is happening yet. That assumption is the mistake. Because real change rarely begins with expansion. It begins with contraction. It begins quietly, almost uncomfortably, and in ways that don't fit the narrative you were given about spiritual progress or awakening. Instead of clarity, there's subtle friction. Instead of excitement, there's restlessness. Instead of answers, there's a faint sense that something no longer fits the way it used to. But here's where the error deepens. Most seekers interpret that discomfort as a problem to fix, rather than information to observe. They try to override it with explanations. They intellectualize it. They distract themselves with more content, more techniques, more searching. Or they dismiss it entirely, telling themselves they're overthinking, imagining things, or not there yet. In doing so, they miss the most important signal reality sends before any visible change occurs. The signal is not external, it's internal dissonance. When your way of perceiving reality starts to shift, the first thing that breaks is coherence. Your old interpretations no longer fully work, but the new ones haven't stabilized yet. This creates a strange in-between state. You can still function, still go through the motions of life, but something feels slightly off. Conversations feel flatter, goals feel less motivating. Even things that once inspired you now feel oddly distant. And because this doesn't look like progress, people assume they're regressing. They don't realize that observation itself is being recalibrated. The mistake is believing that change should feel like movement forward, when in reality it often feels like losing your footing. Like standing on ground that hasn't settled yet. The mind wants certainty, and when it doesn't get it, it tries to rush the process by forcing meaning onto every experience. This is where people start mislabeling coincidences, over-attaching to symbols, or demanding that reality explain itself prematurely. But observation under pressure becomes distortion. Instead of simply noticing what's shifting, the seeker tries to control the narrative. They ask, "What does this mean?" before asking, "What am I actually experiencing?" And that subtle reversal pulls attention away from the lived moment and into mental noise. This is why so many people feel like they're doing the work, but not moving anywhere. They are observing, yes, but through expectation, not presence. Through desire, not awareness. And that kind of observation doesn't reveal reality. It filters it. What almost no one tells you is that the earliest stage of genuine change feels boring, confusing, and slightly uncomfortable. There is no reward signal yet, no confirmation badge, just a growing sensitivity to things that were previously ignored. Tone shifts, emotional reactions that don't make sense, a quiet sense that the old explanations are wearing thin. And if you mistake that for failure, you'll try to escape it. But if you mistake it for success, you'll inflate it. Both reactions miss the point, because what's actually happening is much more subtle. The observer is changing before the observed does, and that creates tension. Not the dramatic kind, the low-grade kind that follows you through the day and makes you wonder why you don't quite feel at home in the way things used to be. That tension isn't a warning sign, it's a threshold, and most people walk right past it chasing clarity, without realizing that the discomfort itself is the doorway they've been waiting for. The same discomfort that begins to show up just before reality starts to feel unfamiliar in a way you can't yet explain. There is a moment that almost everyone encounters before a real shift takes place, and it's rarely described accurately. It doesn't feel like inspiration, it doesn't feel like motivation, and it definitely doesn't feel like clarity. Instead, it shows up as a quiet discomfort that you can't fully name. Not intense enough to call pain, not clear enough to call a problem, just persistent enough to be impossible to ignore. This discomfort doesn't announce itself dramatically. It weaves into ordinary moments. You might notice it while doing something familiar, something you've done hundreds of times, and suddenly it feels slightly foreign. The routine still works, but it doesn't land the same way. The satisfaction you use to extract from it feels diluted. You can't point to a specific reason why, and that's what makes it unsettling. Most people try to get rid of this feeling as quickly as possible. They assume it means something is wrong, that they're losing direction, that they're becoming ungrateful or restless for no reason. So they attempt to fix it by changing circumstances, consuming more information, or forcing themselves back into old motivations. But this discomfort isn't asking to be fixed, it's asking to be noticed. What makes this stage particularly confusing is that, on the surface, nothing is necessarily falling apart. Life may look stable, relationships may still be intact, your identity still functions. And yet internally, there's a growing sense that you no longer fully belong inside the version of reality you've been inhabiting. Not because it's bad, but because it's becoming too small. This is where the mind creates a false narrative. It tells you that if you can just figure out why you feel this way, the discomfort will disappear. So you analyze, you replay conversations, you revisit past decisions, you search for a clean explanation that will restore equilibrium. But the discomfort doesn't come from something you did wrong. It comes from something you're beginning to see, and seeing at first destabilizes. When your perception starts to change, the old emotional reference points stop working. Things that once grounded you no longer do. You don't get the same internal feedback from familiar choices. This creates a subtle identity gap, a space between who you've been and who you're not yet able to define. That space feels like emptiness, but it's actually transition. The problem is that we're conditioned to treat discomfort as a signal to retreat, to return to what's known, to reassert control. But in this context, retreat doesn't bring relief. It brings numbness. You can suppress the discomfort for a while, but it keeps resurfacing, usually at inconvenient times, reminding you that something is unresolved. This is why people often describe this phase as feeling lost, even though nothing tangible has been lost. It's not disorientation in the world, it's disorientation in perception. The lens through which you've been interpreting reality is loosening, and before a new one stabilizes, there's a period where everything feels slightly out of focus. And here's the part few people recognize. This discomfort isn't random. It appears before any meaningful external change because it prepares you to notice differently. If reality shifted without this internal friction, you wouldn't register it. You'd interpret it through old assumptions and miss what's actually new. So the discomfort slows you down. It interrupts automatic reactions. It creates hesitation where there used to be certainty. Not to paralyze you, but to make you more sensitive, more attentive, less certain of your own interpretations. And that uncertainty, while uncomfortable, is what opens the door to deeper observation. Still, the temptation remains to label this feeling as a sign that something is off track, to believe that clarity should come first, followed by peace. But the order is usually reversed. First comes destabilization, then awareness. Then, only later, coherence. If you resist this phase, you don't stop the process, you just delay it. But if you stay with the discomfort without trying to define it too quickly, something interesting begins to happen. You start noticing patterns in how your attention moves. What pulls you, what drains you, what feels strangely charged, even if you don't know why yet. And that's when discomfort starts to transform into curiosity, the kind that makes you notice the smallest coincidences, the subtle repetitions, the seemingly insignificant details that begin to stand out in ways they never did before. Once discomfort has softened your certainty, something else begins to happen almost quietly. Your attention changes. Not in a dramatic, hyper-focused way, but in a subtle widening. Details that used to pass unnoticed start to register. A phrase you hear twice in one day, a number that repeats without trying, a chance encounter that echoes a thought you had earlier, as if reality responded just a second too late to be called intentional. At first you brush these things off. You tell yourself they're random, that the mind is good at finding patterns where none exist. And that explanation is partly true. The mind does look for patterns. But what's usually overlooked is that perception also sharpens when something internal is reorganizing. You're not necessarily seeing more coincidences. You're noticing them differently. This is where many people either inflate the meaning of what's happening or dismiss it entirely. Both reactions miss what these moments are actually doing. Small coincidences are not messages to decode. They're signals that your relationship with observation is changing. When perception shifts, reality doesn't suddenly rearrange itself. Instead, the feedback loop between you and your environment becomes more visible. Things line up just enough to catch your attention, but not enough to force belief. There's ambiguity built into the experience, and that ambiguity is intentional, not as a test but as a safeguard, because the moment you rush to assign meaning, you collapse the observation. You might start saying, "This must mean I'm on the right path," or "This is a sign I should do something drastic," or "Reality is trying to tell me something specific." But the truth is more subtle. These small coincidences aren't instructions. They're calibration points. They show you how you're observing, not what you should do. This is why misinterpretation can stall the process. When someone becomes overly fixated on symbols, numbers, or synchronicities, they shift from awareness into control. They begin watching reality with an agenda, waiting for confirmation instead of staying present. And observation with an agenda becomes selective. You notice only what supports the story you want to tell. On the other hand, when you dismiss coincidences as meaningless, you flatten perception. You reduce everything back to noise. That might protect you from illusion, but it also keeps you from noticing genuine shifts in how your attention interacts with the world. The middle ground is where the real work happens. Small coincidences function like a gentle tap on the shoulder, not saying, "Here's the answer," but asking, "Did you notice that?" They interrupt automatic thinking just enough to bring you back into the moment. And when you don't rush to explain them, they accumulate. Not in intensity, but in frequency. You begin to sense a rhythm rather than a message. What's changing isn't reality itself, but the timing of your awareness. You think a thought and later encounter something that resonates with it. Not because the thought caused it, and not because reality is performing for you, but because your sensitivity to connection has increased. The mind wants causation. Observation invites correlation without conclusion. This is an uncomfortable stance to hold. It requires restraint. It asks you to stay open without turning the experience into a belief system. And that restraint is exactly what most people haven't practiced. This is why small coincidences can become a trap. If you cling to them, they lose their function. If you ignore them, they lose their signal. Their value lies in how they affect your attention, not in what you think they represent. As these moments accumulate, something else starts to happen. You become more aware of how you're observing, not just what you're observing. You notice when you're present and when you're on autopilot. You sense when your mind jumps to conclusions and when it stays with uncertainty a little longer. And here's where the shift becomes delicate, because once you start noticing coincidences, It's easy to believe that observation itself is enough, that simply watching is the work. But observation without consciousness, without awareness of how you're observing, can quietly turn into a loop. You watch, you notice, you interpret, and you reinforce the same patterns over and over again. This is the point where awareness can either deepen or stagnate, and almost no one realizes the difference until they've been stuck in that loop for a long time, mistaking repetition for progress and attention for understanding. At some point, you may realize that you're noticing more than you used to. Patterns, reactions, internal states, subtle shifts in your environment, all of it feels more visible, and that realization can create a quiet sense of confidence. You tell yourself that you're more aware now, more conscious than before, but this is where a hidden danger appears, one that's difficult to detect precisely because it feels like progress. Observation by itself is not consciousness. It's entirely possible to observe while remaining trapped in habit, to notice patterns while reinforcing them, to become very good at watching yourself without ever changing the quality of attention that does the watching. This is how people end up in invisible loops, convinced they're evolving while repeating the same internal movements over and over again. The loop forms when observation becomes automatic. You notice a thought arise, you label it. You notice an emotion, you name it. You see a pattern in your behavior, you acknowledge it, and then you move on, assuming that awareness alone is enough. But nothing actually shifts. The same triggers return, the same reactions follow, the same interpretations quietly reassert themselves. What's missing isn't effort, it's depth. Conscious observation isn't about adding more commentary to experience, it's about changing your relationship to what you're noticing. When observation lacks consciousness, it stays on the surface. It becomes a mental habit, another layer of doing, another identity to maintain. I am someone who notices. I am someone who is aware. And identities, even subtle ones, resist change. This is why observing without consciousness can feel strangely exhausting. You're always watching, always tracking, but never arriving anywhere. You become hyper-aware of your inner world, yet oddly disconnected from it at the same time. There's a distance that wasn't there before. You're observing life rather than participating in it. The danger here isn't passivity, it's fragmentation. When awareness is split between the observer and the observed, without integration, you begin to live in commentary rather than experience. You're constantly one step removed. This creates the illusion of control, but also a sense of detachment that can flatten emotional life. Things don't hit as deeply. Joy feels muted, discomfort feels abstract. Everything is noticed, but nothing is fully felt. This is often mistaken for balance, but it's actually avoidance dressed as awareness. True consciousness doesn't distance you from experience. It brings you into it more fully. It sharpens sensation rather than numbing it. And that's precisely why the mind resists it. Because conscious observation requires vulnerability. It asks you to stay with what's happening without immediately categorizing it, explaining it, or placing it into a familiar framework. When you observe on autopilot, you're still filtering reality through old assumptions. You're watching through memory, through expectation, through the need to maintain coherence with who you believe you are. That kind of observation is safe, predictable, and ultimately limiting. The invisible loop tightens when you start using observation as a way to avoid uncertainty. You think that by watching everything carefully, you can prevent surprise, discomfort, or loss of control. But in doing so, you drain observation of its transformative power. It becomes surveillance instead of presence. This is where many people get stuck for years. They read more, they reflect more, they notice more, but nothing fundamentally changes because their way of observing hasn't changed. It's still driven by the mind's need to stay ahead of experience rather than meet it as it unfolds. Conscious observation, on the other hand, has a different texture. It's slower, less certain. There's more silence in it, fewer conclusions. It allows things to remain unresolved without rushing to close the loop, and that openness creates a kind of internal tension that the mind doesn't like, the tension of not knowing. But that tension is exactly what makes new perception possible. Without it, observation simply reinforces the familiar. With it, something else can emerge, a moment where reality seems to respond before your mind has time to interpret what's happening, a sense that something has shifted, even though you can't yet explain how or why. And that's when the most unsettling phase begins, when you feel that something has already changed, but the understanding hasn't caught up yet. There comes a point where something shifts, and you feel it before you can think it. Not as an idea, not as a conclusion, but as a subtle internal recognition. It's as if reality has already moved, already answered, while your mind is still trying to catch up. You sense that something is different, yet every attempt to explain it feels premature, almost invasive. This is deeply uncomfortable for the mind. The mind is built to interpret first and feel second. It wants sequence, logic, cause and effect. So when reality seems to respond without giving the mind time to narrate the process, confusion arises. You may feel slightly disoriented, as though you skipped a step you were supposed to understand. But nothing is missing. What's happening is simply outside the mind's usual timing. Perception doesn't always update in neat order. Sometimes the shift occurs at a level below language. Your reactions change before your beliefs do. Your choices feel different before you can justify them. You find yourself not engaging in things you once tolerated, not chasing what once motivated you, not reacting the way you used to. And only later do you realize that something fundamental has been reorganized. This is where people often make a critical error. They assume they need to figure it out before trusting it. So they pause. They second guess. They wait for a mental green light that never fully arrives. And in doing so, they create friction between what's already happening and what they think should be happening. The mind starts interrogating the experience instead of letting it unfold. But reality doesn't wait for interpretation. When your way of observing reaches a certain threshold, responses begin to appear faster than explanation. A conversation lands differently. An opportunity opens or closes without drama. A decision makes itself quietly, without debate. And afterward, the mind scrambles to claim authorship, to build a story that makes it all feel intentional and controlled. Yet the truth is more unsettling and more liberating. You didn't decide in the way you think you did. You aligned. And alignment doesn't announce itself with reasons. It announces itself with resonance. This can feel destabilizing because it challenges the belief that understanding must precede action. We're taught that clarity comes first, then movement. But here, movement happens first, understanding lags behind, and that delay creates vulnerability. You're moving without a map, responding without a script. For many people, this is the moment they try to pull back. They tell themselves they're being impulsive, irrational, or reckless. They slow down unnecessarily, hoping to regain a sense of mental authority. But what they're really resisting is the loss of their usual control structure. The mind wants to stay in charge, even when it's no longer the most accurate instrument. This doesn't mean the mind becomes useless. It means its role changes. Instead of leading, it follows. Instead of deciding, it integrates. And that shift can feel like confusion, especially if you equate confusion with failure. But confusion, in this context, is not disorientation. It's reorganization. You're no longer interpreting reality through the same filters, but the new ones haven't fully formed yet. So things feel unfinished, incomplete. You sense coherence, but you can't articulate it. You feel movement, but you can't define the direction. This is why people in this phase often feel out of sync with others. Conversations seem slower. Social expectations feel misaligned. You're responding from a place others can't see yet, including your own analytical mind. And that gap creates pressure. The pressure to explain yourself, to justify your choices, to make sense of what you feel before you're ready. If you give in to that pressure too early, you risk collapsing the process back into familiar patterns. You trade resonance for rationale, and something essential gets lost. If you stay with it, however, something else emerges. You begin to recognize that confusion isn't an obstacle. It's a sign that your internal order is shifting faster than your language can track. And that realization changes how you relate to uncertainty itself, not as something to eliminate, but as something to move through carefully. Because the real challenge isn't that reality responded before your mind understood. It's learning how to live in that gap without trying to close it prematurely, especially when everything around you starts to feel confusing in ways that no longer match your old explanations. If your life feels confusing right now, it's tempting to assume something has gone wrong. Confusion has a bad reputation. It's associated with mistakes, poor judgment, or a lack of direction. We're taught to seek clarity as quickly as possible and to treat uncertainty as a flaw that needs correction. So when confusion settles in and refuses to leave, the instinct is to fix it or escape it. But the kind of confusion you may be experiencing now doesn't come from chaos. It comes from transition. What makes this phase so disorienting is that your external life may not reflect the internal shift that's already underway. Your responsibilities haven't disappeared. Your roles are still there. From the outside, things look mostly the same, yet internally, the logic that used to organize everything no longer holds. The rules you lived by feel less convincing. The motivations that once drove you feel weaker or strangely irrelevant. This creates a split experience. You're living in a structure that still exists, while perceiving it through a lens that's changing. Confusion emerges when old interpretations stop working before new ones are available. You're no longer fully identified with the past version of yourself, but the next version hasn't become coherent yet. So you hover in between, aware enough to feel the mismatch, but not settled enough to resolve it. The mind doesn't like this state. It wants resolution. It wants labels. It wants to know what this means and where it's going, so it starts searching for clarity prematurely. You might catch yourself trying to make big decisions just to relieve the tension, or replaying the same questions over and over, hoping repetition will produce insight. But forced clarity doesn't stabilize confusion. It freezes it. This is why trying to figure everything out right now can actually intensify the feeling of being lost. Clarity that arrives too early is usually borrowed from the past. It uses familiar explanations to cover unfamiliar territory. And while that can temporarily reduce anxiety, it also locks perception into patterns that no longer fit. You end up explaining away your own experience instead of listening to it. Another reason this confusion feels so pervasive is that it affects not just your thoughts, but your sense of timing. Things feel off. Decisions feel either rushed or delayed. You may feel behind in some areas and strangely ahead in others. This temporal distortion is a sign that your internal compass is being recalibrated. You're no longer orienting yourself by the same markers. Goals that once gave you direction now feel hollow, while things you can't yet name begin to pull at your attention. That pull doesn't come with instructions, it comes with ambiguity, and ambiguity, when sustained, can feel exhausting. This is often when people start doubting themselves. They assume that if they were really growing or evolving, things would feel more stable, not less. But stability is not the same as coherence. Stability can exist in a system that no longer reflects who you are. Coherence, on the other hand, requires internal alignment, and alignment often disrupts before it settles. Confusion, in this sense, is evidence that your internal structure is loosening. That loosening makes room for a different way of engaging with reality, but it also removes familiar anchors. You can't rely on the same instincts yet because they're being updated. You can't rely on the same explanations because they're losing relevance. So you're left with a gap, a space where you must move more slowly, observe more carefully, and tolerate not knowing. If you try to escape this phase, you'll likely revert to old patterns simply because they're familiar. Not because they're true, but because they're comfortable. And that's why so many people eventually return to the same version of life they thought they had outgrown. Not because change was impossible, but because sustaining awareness through confusion requires something rarely discussed: the willingness to remain present without resolution, right at the point where most people decide it's easier to go back than to stay. There is a very specific moment in this process where most people stop, turn around, and quietly return to the life they were living before. It doesn't look like failure. From the outside, it often looks like maturity, realism, or getting back to normal. But internally, it's a retreat, not because the path was wrong, but because sustaining conscious awareness demands more than people expect. This point arrives after confusion has settled in and refused to resolve itself. You've waited for clarity, you've stayed open, you've tried not to force conclusions, and still the uncertainty remains. Not sharp enough to push you forward, not dramatic enough to justify change, just persistent. That persistence slowly erodes motivation. This is where doubt changes tone. Earlier, doubt felt curious. Now it feels heavy. You begin to question whether anything actually changed at all, whether you imagined the whole thing. Whether this was just another phase, another psychological loop, another distraction from real life. The mind starts offering a familiar bargain, stability in exchange for awareness. And it's an attractive offer. All you have to do is stop paying such close attention. Stop questioning the way you interpret things. Stop tolerating ambiguity. You can readopt old explanations, old goals, old rhythms. They still work well enough. They may not excite you, but they're predictable. And predictability feels like relief after prolonged uncertainty. So most people take the deal. They tell themselves they've outgrown the questions, that they were overanalyzing, that life is simpler than they made it. They don't feel dramatic disappointment, just a subtle closing, a narrowing of perception. Attention returns to autopilot, and with it comes a sense of normalcy that feels comforting, if a little flat. What makes this point so decisive is that nothing external forces the choice. No crisis, no ultimatum, just quiet fatigue. Because conscious observation requires energy, not the kind that comes from effort, but the kind that comes from presence, staying aware without certainty, staying engaged without narrative payoff, staying honest without immediate reward. And over time, that can feel like carrying weight with no visible progress. This is the moment where people mistake endurance for stagnation. They assume that if nothing has resolved yet, nothing will. They forget that internal reorganization doesn't move on a visible timeline. They forget that perception shifts before outcomes do. And because nothing dramatic has happened, they conclude that nothing meaningful ever will. So they go back. Not all at once. Gradually. They stop noticing small details. They stop questioning their reactions. They fill the space with noise, productivity, entertainment, obligation, and life continues, it always does. But something subtle changes. There's a faint sense of compression, like squeezing back into a shape that no longer fits perfectly. It's not painful enough to demand attention, but it's there. Occasionally it shows up as restlessness, irritability, or a vague sense of resignation. Most people ignore it. That's how the system sustains itself. What's rarely acknowledged is that giving up at this point isn't a conscious decision. It's a drift, a gradual trade of sensitivity for comfort. And because the discomfort that started this process is no longer acute, it feels like relief rather than loss. Until something triggers it again, a moment, a memory, a conversation, a quiet recognition that the old way of seeing never fully returned, that the questions were never answered, just postponed. And this is where the process becomes irreversible in a subtle way. Even when you go back, you don't go back completely. Something in you knows what it feels like to observe without immediately collapsing experience into explanation. You've touched that threshold, and once touched, it leaves a residue. This is why some people feel a strange dissatisfaction even when life is fine. They did what they were supposed to do. They stabilized. They moved on. But the sense that something essential was left unfinished doesn't fully disappear. And for those who don't give up, who stay with awareness even when it feels unrewarding, something unexpected happens. They begin to realize that the struggle was never about changing reality at all. It was about understanding the role they've been playing in how reality appears to them. And that realization leads to a twist that challenges almost everything they assumed about change in the first place. At some point, a realization begins to form, not as a sudden insight but as a quiet correction. The narrative you may have been carrying starts to loosen. The idea that you shifted realities, that something external rearranged itself for you, begins to feel slightly off. Not wrong in a dramatic sense, just inaccurate. And that's when the twist reveals itself. You didn't change realities. Reality didn't move. You did. More precisely, the way you observed changed, and that altered everything you thought was happening. The world didn't split, upgrade, or transform in response to you. It remained largely the same. What shifted was the lens through which you interpret experience. And because perception shapes meaning, that shift feels just as powerful as a change in circumstance. This can be uncomfortable to accept. There's something reassuring about believing that reality itself has changed. It suggests progress, movement, achievement. But recognizing that the observer has changed removes the sense of spectacle. It brings the focus inward, to something quieter and less controllable. You can't point to a moment where it happened. You can't prove it with events. You can only notice its effects. And those effects are subtle but pervasive. Things don't necessarily improve overnight. Your life doesn't suddenly align into a perfect pattern. Instead, you respond differently. Situations that once triggered you now pass with less friction. Decisions feel simpler, not because you have more information, but because less internal resistance is present. You're not constantly negotiating with yourself. This is where many people feel disoriented again. If reality didn't change, then what was all that discomfort for? Why the confusion, the coincidences, the internal shifts? The answer isn't mystical, it's structural. Your perception reorganized itself to become more accurate, less reactive, less filtered by expectation. Accuracy doesn't feel dramatic, it feels ordinary, almost disappointingly so. There's no fireworks, just a quiet sense that things are seen more clearly than before. And clarity, when genuine, rarely announces itself. It simply operates. This is also why the mind resists this realization. It wants transformation to look extraordinary. It wants proof, milestones, confirmation. But the deepest changes often leave no spectacle behind. They remove distortion rather than add novelty. You didn't enter a new reality. You stopped misinterpreting the one you were already in. That distinction matters because it changes how you move forward. If you believe reality must change again for you to grow, you'll keep waiting for external shifts. You'll scan for signs, for alignments, for proof that something new has happened. But if you recognize that perception is the primary variable, your attention turns to how you're seeing, not what you're seeing. This doesn't make life passive, it makes it responsive. You're no longer trying to force outcomes to match internal narratives. You're adjusting your narratives to match what's actually unfolding. That reduces friction. And reduced friction creates the feeling of flow that people often mislabel as luck or manifestation. Still, this realization can feel destabilizing. If the change was internal all along, then the responsibility shifts as well. You can't outsource awareness. You can't wait for reality to confirm you're ready. Observation becomes an ongoing practice rather than a one-time event. And that demands honesty, especially when perception slips back into habit. Because it does slip. Old filters return under stress. Familiar interpretations reassert themselves when you're tired, distracted, or emotionally charged. This doesn't mean the shift was false. It means it's not permanent by default. It requires maintenance, not through effort, but through attentiveness. And this is where another subtle insight emerges. If your way of observing has changed, then what brought you to this moment wasn't random. Not because reality arranged it, but because your sensitivity increased to the point where certain information, certain perspectives, certain reflections became visible and relevant. Which raises a quiet but unsettling question. If the world didn't change and you didn't change realities, then what actually brought you here, to this exact moment, to this specific recognition, if not chance, curiosity, or external influence? It's easy to say that you're here because of the algorithm, because of curiosity, or because you were looking for something to pass the time. Those explanations are convenient. They keep everything neutral and accidental. But if you're honest, they don't quite explain the timing. They don't explain why this and why now, because you've scrolled past countless videos before this one. What brought you here wasn't a push from the outside. It was a pull from within, subtle, unannounced, and easy to ignore. Something in you recognized relevance before your mind had a chance to evaluate it. Not relevance in terms of information, but in terms of resonance. A quiet alignment between where your attention has been drifting and what this moment reflects back to you. This doesn't mean the video contains answers you didn't already have. It means your sensitivity has reached a point where certain questions can no longer stay in the background. They've been forming slowly beneath language, beneath conscious intention, and now they're close enough to the surface to guide your attention. That's the part people misunderstand. You didn't arrive here to be convinced of something new. You arrived here because something familiar is being recognized from a different angle. The words may feel new, but the recognition isn't. It has the texture of remembering rather than learning, of noticing rather than acquiring. This is how attention works when it's no longer fully automatic. You don't chase what's loudest. You respond to what's precise, and precision doesn't shout. It waits. When it appears, it feels oddly personal, even when it's clearly not designed specifically for you. That's because relevance isn't about personalization. It's about timing. Earlier in your life, this video would have meant nothing, or it would have felt abstract, ungrounded, easy to dismiss. Not because it was wrong, but because you weren't oriented to notice what it's pointing toward. Orientation determines meaning more than content ever does. What changed is not your intelligence or your openness, it's your threshold. Your tolerance for ambiguity increased. Your need for constant explanation softened. You became more comfortable noticing without immediately concluding. And that shift reorganized how your attention moves through the world. Certain things fade, others stand out, not by force, but by fit. This is why it doesn't feel accidental. Still, there's a danger here. It's tempting to romanticize the moment. To believe that being here marks you as different, chosen, or ahead. But that interpretation would miss the point entirely. What brought you here wasn't uniqueness, it was readiness. Readiness doesn't mean completion, it means availability. Availability to notice when perception shifts, to recognize when old explanations no longer hold, to stay with questions that don't resolve on command. And that availability is fragile. It can close just as quietly as it opened. Which is why what happens next matters more than what's already happened. Because being drawn here doesn't guarantee integration. Many people encounter moments like this and let them pass. They feel the resonance, nod internally, and then return to habitual modes of seeing without letting anything reorganize. The experience becomes just another mental bookmark, interesting but inert. Integration requires a different response, not agreement, not belief. But a willingness to let this moment adjust how you observe what comes after it, to notice whether your attention behaves differently, whether you listen more closely, whether you pause more often before reacting. These are small shifts, almost invisible, but they determine whether recognition becomes change or fades back into noise. This is the quiet divide between those who consume and those who integrate. And it doesn't hinge on understanding everything that's been said. It hinges on a single, understated choice you make once the stimulus ends. A choice so simple, it's easy to overlook, yet powerful enough to determine whether this moment dissolves or becomes a reference point that subtly alters how you move through what follows. There is a small adjustment that happens at the very end of moments like this, and it's so understated that most people miss it. Not because it's complicated, but because it doesn't announce itself as important. It doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like a pause, a subtle space where you either return to habit or allow something to reorient quietly. Those who only watch usually do so with appreciation. They feel resonance. They recognize themselves in the words. They may even feel moved or validated, but the experience remains contained. It stays in the mind, categorized as interesting, true, or relatable. And once the stimulus ends, attention resets to default. Integration begins somewhere else entirely, It begins when you allow the experience to remain unfinished. Instead of seeking closure, you let the lack of resolution linger. You don't rush to explain what this meant or how it applies. You don't summarize it into a takeaway or a belief. You simply notice what happens to your attention once the input stops, how your body feels, how your thoughts slow down or speed up, how the environment around you seems slightly more vivid or slightly more distant. This is not reflection in the analytical sense. It's attunement. The adjustment is this. You shift from consuming meaning to observing effect. Most people try to understand first and then live differently later. Integration reverses that order. You live slightly differently first, often without realizing it, and understanding arrives afterward, if it arrives at all. The change is behavioral, not conceptual. A longer pause before responding. A softer reaction where there used to be tension. A choice not to engage where engagement was habitual. These are not dramatic changes. That's why they work. The mind wants a clear marker to confirm that something has integrated. It wants a feeling of certainty or transformation. But integration often feels anticlimactic, almost invisible. The only evidence is a change in how attention moves when no one is watching. This is also where resistance appears. Because integration requires relinquishing commentary. You don't get to narrate the process as it unfolds. You don't get to claim progress or identity around it. In fact, the more you try to track it, the more it slips back into observation without consciousness, the loop you've already seen. So the final adjustment isn't effort, it's restraint. Restraint from turning this into a conclusion. Restraint from seeking reassurance. Restraint from immediately sharing, labeling, or applying what you think you've grasped. You let the experience change the background processes instead of the foreground story. This is why so few people integrate. Not because it's difficult, but because it offers no immediate reward. No dopamine hit, no sense of achievement. Just a quieter internal environment and a slightly altered relationship with what happens next. But that alteration compounds. Over time, these small adjustments accumulate. You begin to notice that you're less reactive without trying to be, that certain patterns lose their grip without being fought, that decisions emerge with less internal debate. None of this feels extraordinary. It feels practical, ordinary, almost boring. And that's the point. Integration doesn't pull you out of life. It drops you deeper into it, with fewer filters and less resistance. You're not performing awareness, you're living from it. And because there's no spectacle attached, it's easy to underestimate how much has actually shifted. Those who only watch often look for the next video, the next insight, the next confirmation. Those who integrate move differently without needing reinforcement. Their attention has changed, and that change reorganizes experience quietly, continuously. The separation between the two isn't intelligence or discipline, it's willingness. Willingness to let this moment affect how you observe the next one. Willingness to remain slightly more present than comfortable. Willingness to trust subtle changes over dramatic conclusions. And once that adjustment is made, there's nothing left to add. Only something to notice, not here, not in words, but in the moments that follow, when you return to your life and realize that the proof was never meant to be found in what you watched, but in how you now see what comes after. This video doesn't prove anything on its own. It never needed to. The only thing that mattered was the subtle recognition you felt while listening. That quiet sense that something in you was already shifting before any words tried to explain it. If that resonance was there, it's because your way of seeing is no longer exactly the same as it was before. Nothing dramatic needs to happen next. No conclusion needs to be reached. Just notice how you observe what follows. The tone of your thoughts. The pace of your reactions. The way ordinary moments register differently when you're not rushing to interpret them. Real change doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself in how you meet what's already here. If you made it to the end of this video, write the word watch in the comments. Not for the algorithm, but as a quiet marker that you stayed present all the way through. And if this content resonated, and you want to continue exploring from this depth, watch one of the videos appearing on your screen now. They build from the same space of awareness, not to give you answers, but to help you notice more clearly what's already unfolding.